Hello, I'm talking to you from the land of the Waikamekos peoples. The Tundotank, the Waikameko, the Pocomoke, the Nanticoke, the Manikin, the Choptank tribes. I'm talking from the land and from the indigenous folk who peopled this land for millennia before European settlers arrived. I'm also going to set the current context, and I'll come back to why that's important in a moment. Right now, we are living through COVID-19, a worldwide pandemic that has wreaked havoc across our educational systems as well as our economic systems, and it questions our national identities. In my own country of the United States, over 200,000 Americans have died. So we have 200,000 Americans at this point who have died because of this preventable disease. We are practicing social distancing, which we would do in normal countries anyway if this were the situation that were going on. By that, what I mean is we're not in a conference room. You and I are not sitting next to each other and we're not having a pleasant conversation. I am talking to a screen. This is the virtual world we live in today, an online universe where I don't even know what time of day or where you'll be watching this. And that's unusual because we used to have an interaction. We used to be able to read body language and see where people were responding to things we said. And I don't have that now. That's the world we are in. The point of all of this is that context matters. And I'll be coming back to that multiple times in this conversation. So I'm presenting on the movement from culturally responsive pedagogy to the notion of critically contextual, culturally sustaining pedagogy. My name is Kyriacopoulos, and I work at Salisbury University on the eastern shore of Maryland. To begin with, I want to talk about the original purposes of schooling, public schooling. When public schooling began in the United States of America, there were a number of goals that were preeminent before all others. One of those goals was to Americanize newly arrived immigrants. In public schools, the attempt was to make those who come from other parts of the world more like us, whoever that us may be. And in so doing, one of the primary goals was to assimilate those from different nationalities and from different practices. So in some ways, while we were emphasizing today culturally sustaining pedagogy, at that point in time, they were trying to eliminate what they saw as culture or the culture of other places. And part of that was to move people beyond their original countries and their original homes and into whatever American was. And so there were fixed definitions about what that was, but we'll talk about that another time. Another goal was to simply eradicate people who were different from us. The movement to put Native Americans into Native American boarding schools was the goal of virtually eliminating what was Indian about them in the first place. They were not allowed to speak their own languages. They were often grouped with different tribes who they had nothing in common with. And the end result was to have a uniform person come out on the other end of this schooling experience who could fit in and assimilate to worker life in the United States. We have to wonder whether the goal ever has been to actually educate. And by educate, I mean emancipate. I mean giving children the possibility and potential to actually grow beyond their standards and their means, to recognize that they could change the society around them. That if there were things that they thought were unjust, they could make those more just in time through working through their educational practice. So whether that ever was a purpose of schooling or not, it has been alluded to multiple times, and we'll come back to that as well. One of the things that we need to think about today, what I'll be centering, is the idea of context in the concept of culturally relevant pedagogy. So one of the original moves that happened as a result of Congressional Representative Moynihan's report in 1963 on the Negro family, the case for national action, was examining the problems of those who've been marginalized in our population, those people who had routinely seen themselves oppressed because of forces around them, denying them their ability to be human, was what is called the cultural deficit model. Moynihan's title, The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, clearly posits the Negro family as a problem. They are the problem that must be fixed. Hence the idea of assimilation, right? So if we take away their Negro-ness, they will then become more American. The problem with all of this idea is that it highlights an approach to children that sees them as broken. It sees them as missing pieces, and that we as public school teachers must fix these gaping holes in their family life, in their cultural background, in their neighborhoods, wherever they came from. We must fix what is not there. And that has led to a lot of erroneous conclusions on the part of teachers, to the idea that when we look at children's culture, those cultures are broken. E.D. Hirsch came up with the idea of cultural literacy. And in this place, he thought of the notion that all Americans have a common culture. Now, E.D. Hirsch was a white, rich man, is a white, rich man, and still thinks that people have a common culture, that there is something that is common in American history that describes a specific single culture. This is a predominant view of a cultural deficit model approach. Part of the idea here is that knowledge is independent of the knower and must be grasped from outside. I'll get more into that idea in a minute. Part of what this relies upon is the notion of rejecting what the child already knows. That is, the conclusion is what is known beforehand is irrelevant. Children must come to us to learn what is valuable about society and about being around other people. Now, in stark contrast to that, the concept of culturally relevant pedagogy came from the work of brilliant African-American scholars Geneva Gay, Gloria Ladson-Billings, and Django Paris. Now, these three preeminent scholars in their field put forward the idea that knowledge has cultural bias, that the way things are built in our schools and in our classrooms and in our curricula are biased. There is a cultural backing, cultural history to them that does not acknowledge the history of many children in our groups. What we are doing in this field of work is incorporating children's funds of knowledge, to quote Louis Moll. And from that work, we're looking at the idea that children come to us with a whole storehouse of knowledge, a whole wealth of information and background and history and culture that we could use to leverage new learning. And that's the practice that we have been doing in this specific model. So critically culturally sustaining pedagogy looks at the idea of what Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson-Billings produced, the idea of what was first culturally responsive and then became culturally relevant pedagogy. What they were looking at is the ways that teachers ignored children's histories as they came through the threshold of the classroom door. So when you tell a child to keep their family language outside of your classroom, to not speak Spanish when we're in the classroom, or to not use the word ain't in our space, we are ignoring the history that comes behind them. We are ignoring the stories that they bring in. Rather than looking at children as blank slates that need to be filled with our received knowledge, culturally responsive and culturally relevant pedagogy sees that the culture that's coming into the classroom is something that we could actually employ, we could work with. We can talk about the history of to be and how ain't is older than isn't. We could bring in some of the concepts that they use at home and in the neighborhood that we could then incorporate in our own classrooms, thereby making our culture and our pedagogy relevant to their history and their worlds, the worlds of people who may not experience majoritarian viewpoints, who may not experience the dominant perspective. Ladson-Billings then toyed with an idea of critical race theory and education. Critical race theory begins with the premise that race is fundamental to the ways that we view things in the United States. Critical race theory came out of critical law and race theory, the two different fields coming together to form critical race theory in legal practices. Gloria Ladson-Billings and a number of other scholars combined them to think about how can critical race theory be applied in education. And what you found was often predominantly white teachers will marginalize predominantly non-white people, Black, brown, and even Asian, and view them as more broken than their white peers. Then we will examine how that impact affects their educational experience. Some 10 years later, Django Paris came up with the idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy. Beyond just acknowledging, yes, you can use ain't in my classroom, or yes, we'll talk about hip hop when we come in, but we're going to go on to talk about other things. Culturally sustaining pedagogy is maintaining and supporting the original pedagogy that comes in, the original culture that comes into the classroom. So you can use those fields, hip hop or Native American arts, and incorporate them in what happens in your geometry class or in your mathematics class or in your language arts class. So you include both the culture of the child and the culture that you are trying to teach in academic circles to be sustaining. The move we're making here, that is another step in the process, is the idea of singling out and centering context, recognizing that critical culturally sustaining pedagogy must begin with the context of the kid who is being taught, rather than the idea that content overwhelms students. So I'm teaching social studies. If you've come from a family where you didn't get to have breakfast this morning because you were feeding all of your siblings before you got on the bus to come to school, I don't care. I'm going to talk about the prison to school system, school to prison system. I might talk about our electoral college and ignore completely the fact that your parents may have had some experience with incarceration or may have some experience being senators themselves. None of that will weigh in how I discuss the concept myself. Critical culturally sustaining pedagogy brings that all in. So I will talk about hunger and what it is like to be hungry and what it means when you come to school when you are hungry because you are deprived, and how hard it is to then concentrate when you are on that pyramid and you are at the very bottom just trying to sustain yourself. The view from here suggests that we have to, as teachers, figure out where our students are coming from. So one of the key components that we begin with is the funds of knowledge approach. That our kids on the Eastern Shore, they may be fisher folk, they may be people who've had experience with incarceration, they may be people who are farmers. All of that comes into their history as being teachers, students in our classroom. So when I think about mathematics, I might think about whether they know farming. I might think about, when it comes to science, their own experience with fishing and all the different kind of fish that they may be pulling out of the water. These are ways of incorporating the students' funds of knowledge, their background experience in leveraging new learning. One of the things that we will posit first in a classroom where this is happening is the idea of the social construction of knowledge, that we together, student and teacher, construct knowledge with each other. We come to agreed upon definitions within our classroom. And we may say, in this room, we mean this when we talk about respect. And we will come up with our own definitions rather than refer to some third outside source or to some sustained received knowledge from external events. We will then talk about what respect means here, now, with us. How will you know that I'm respecting you? How will I know that you're respecting me? The point of all of this is that the knower lives in a society. Okay, rather than being independent, rather than knowledge being some separate thing out there that we have to point knowers toward, whether I am the receiver of knowledge and I am then spewing out my wisdom into their blank slate minds, this idea, the idea of critical, culturally sustaining contextual pedagogy, employs the funds of knowledge and the social construction of knowledge to examine the fact that the knower is in a society. She lives in a space. She is sexual. She is racial. She is political. She is contextual. That is, there is a rich network of resources that can be used to sustain and develop new learning if I acknowledge where the child comes from first. If my initial approach to teaching is not the content I have to teach, but the child in front of me. The great Rita Pearson made the point that every child deserves a champion, an adult who will always believe in them, who will always expect greater things from them, and knows that they are capable of far more than they themselves believe they are. That is what involves culturally, critically sustaining pedagogy. The idea that our students are more than anyone else thinks they are, and that we recognize them as people, not as blank slates or as empty vessels or as broken machinery that need to be fixed by coming to school. Context matters. When we talk about the work that we do in our classrooms as elementary school teachers, each and every child is unique, which means I cannot teach to a cookie cutter model of a child. But similarly, each teacher is unique, We come with our own passions, our own skills, our own backgrounds, and that has to be incorporated in how we approach teaching. The first thing that most of these teachers will do, and what we train them to do, is learn the child. So rather than expecting the kid to come to me to be taught my wisdom, I go to the child and I learn from them. Sometimes it's a matter of simply trying to gain their perspective, to see how they see. But we begin by learning the child. What skills are already there? Are they skateboarders? Do they know how to ride a bike? Are they fisher folk? Do they know how to cook? Are they perfumers? What do they do at home? Where is their main motivation when they're not in my classroom? Recognizing that they have traditions and histories in their families and their cultures and their backgrounds that we could then think about as being resources for us. What is their community? What do they go to when they are not with us? Where do they hang out? Who do they see themselves as members of? Is it a temple? Is it a church? Is it a mosque? Where they come together on picnics on Sunday or Saturday? What sports they're involved in? By learning these things, I can then forward new learning, leveraging new skills based on my knowledge of their own experiences out already before they came to me. Then I can view them as resources and curricula. Frequently, when I teach in elementary schools, I teach origami, I'll teach paper folding, and I'll find out that the kids know it already, and they want to show me each of their examples, the things that they love to do the most. And I give the floor over to them to teach us all new origami, whatever they might be wanting to teach us. But by doing so, I invest in the children themselves. I say, you are experts in these areas too, and I want you to show us that expertise. I want you to be a resource for us when it comes to the material that we're looking at. This is also a means towards professionalizing curricula. Frequently, teachers are handed material from different district headquarters, and that material is even told to be teacher-proof. So it's the idea that even a teacher can't mess this up. Instead, we look at curricula and we examine it from a professional lens, from this critically, culturally, contextual, social understanding of knowledge. And we examine the language that the curricula is put out in, the ways that we different view it. And we will notice that sometimes the language puts forward one specific way of looking at things. So our students and our teachers begin to examine curriculum through a discourse analysis model. They look at the words that are being used, they look at the dominant narrative that is being forwarded, and begin to examine it from multiple perspectives. And that's a key point to this method. This method involves deeply understanding different perspectives, different orientations. So there will be a teacher who will talk about the ways to examine what is being handed down from the state and from the school district, and examining it through a lens of discourse analysis. One of our ways of looking closely into how deeply context matters is seeing the kid's perspective. And I mean that literally. I mean that I know a teacher who got down on the floor with her student to work next to her in parallel with her as she worked on the floor, never asking the child to get up and sit in her desk properly. She never said that. All what she said was, I'll work next to you. You show me how you learn. When we examine children from their own viewpoint, when we join with them in their learning, we can gain much more understanding of how to teach new stuff, new material, as they are from that orientation. One of the other goals that we will look at is activating prior knowledge. So we can say this rhythm, this rhyme that we get from this poem fits similarly to that hip hop tune you were humming the other day. And I can go into the idea of how what is out in popular culture is reflective of older generations of learning, of older generations of style and music. And I might point that out. I might say, this sounds very similar to this form of music. And I can then activate that. How is this like that? How is this engaging with critical thinking? I can work students towards thinking in analogies and allegories. So they want to think in analogy, I can talk about how is this like this previous experience? For instance, I could say, how is Roman law, which we're studying in social studies, like contemporary law? And how are they similar and different? How is the Roman use of military in the civilian population similar or different to the police use of force in modern school settings or modern contemporary America? This is activating prior learning, prior engagement, experiences they've had themselves with the content of what I'm teaching, contextualizing that content, giving it a space in their lives. And that's what we mean by context matters, which we're coming back to more and more times again. So a part of this whole conversation is to center the experience of the child in the classroom itself, not just in terms of new learning, that is what they've come to us to gather, but learning from the child what they have before they start learning from us, before they get to the space where we can actually engage with them. If you have any questions, please do feel free to get in contact. We are continuing to work on this process, and there will be 2 more videos in this series to hear from the teachers themselves in the classrooms as we examine more deeply what this theoretical practice looks like on the ground in an actual classroom. Thank you very much.